clearly I'm living my life to some extent by this belief. And if I found out, oh, hey, I don't have any data to back that up, uh, I would certainly have to reconsider. Yeah, I guess the gist of my claim is that any large organization of humans um, is sort of doomed to either inefficiency or corruption, maybe at its worst case, um, lack of empathy, maybe at its most subtle but bad case. But basically, as a group of people grows larger and has to create more systems of abstraction to effectively um, govern or manage that set of people, you kind of get further and further away from an optimal structure, and that kind of leads to um, people not really caring about each other, dehumanizing each other, um, people cheating the system because they don't really see or appreciate the effect that it has to the whoever's on the receiving end, and that overall it's just not something that we have figured out how to manage. But in spite of that problem, we keep grouping together in these larger and larger organizations of people, whether it be whole countries or extremely large cities or global corporations that have offices in tons of countries, and in all of those cases, the people involved, to me, seem to be on the whole just kind of less happy and have less control than is sometimes necessary to do the right thing.
Okay, it's a pretty big claim, in the sense of there's a lot going on.
A lot of pieces.
I'll try to restate it, and you see if I'm saying what you're saying. Maybe to really condense it,
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that the best way to organize society is with smaller groups than we have now. Is that it close? Can you work on that?
My only concern about that is how vague or open to interpretation the best is.
Yeah, I think we should explore that, actually.
Okay.
What do you think? I mean, you've mentioned all sorts of different kinds of organizing bodies, right? Like there's all the way from a family, I guess maybe the smallest or something like that, a relationship, to apartment buildings, to maybe regions of a city, to cities, to states, to countries, and then to stuff like the EU, that even span countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as the role of these organizing bodies, and do the roles change as the size changes?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the objective of the body is. So, for instance, for a corporation, it would be to make the most amount of money. You could still slice and dice that by like most amount of money in the short term, in the long term, for
Sure.
who. But that's kind of the vague idea there. I guess I would say when it comes to a governmental organization, it's really hard to state their goal. I suppose I would probably say to minimize the suffering of its citizens. Seems to me to be the important thing. We don't tend to say a lot of like, oh, look at all these people prospering really well. No one points to that. So it's not about the upper bound. It seems to be about minimizing the lower bound, making sure the fewest people are poor or sad or the least amount of violence, that kind of thing.
is that what you think is important, or what you think other people think is important?
I would say that I think that that is fairly important because it wouldn't really matter how good my life was if there was like bodies in the streets, right?
Okay.
Um, versus, if everybody that I knew was happy and healthy, um, I don't think that I would be distraught over not like being extremely rich or
Uh-huh.
anything like that.
So you see the role of governments as being one of focusing on the less fortunate members of this of that group,
Yeah,
and
kind of a
trying to bring people up.
yeah, kind of an equalizer, given that sort of the only tool at their disposal is either use of force or reallocation of wealth by use of force. So kind of clamping.
So let's for the moment let's stick with governments, and maybe we'll come back to businesses because they seem to have different goals.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't think you know companies are subject to the same sort of goal, right? Which is to try to minimize the suffering of their employees.
Yeah, like I guess the equivalent would be like a company can fire somebody, but almost no country is exiling people. Um,
Yeah. So okay, so if we stick with countries, maybe so to try to restate it again, maybe the best way that governing bodies um, can help the least fortunate members of their society is actually by remaining small. Is that maybe closer to um, like a concrete claim?
yeah, okay. I would like put my stamp on that statement.
Okay. How confident are you that this is true? How confident are you that the smaller a governing body is, the better it helps the least fortunate, the less fortunate?
I would say I'm willing to bet very high on the statistical likelihood of that. So, if you were to look at all the large governing bodies and all the small ones, that probably the average person's happiness is larger in the smaller one. I would say that there are probably fringe cases that make the claim look a lot worse, um, of
Do you
like a
have
small
specific
city.
do you have specific examples in mind, or?
I guess I don't know exactly the population count, but I think of a Flint, Michigan, or somewhere that's not like a major city, but there's still like rampant corruption and an inability to uh, even provide some of the basic necessities for its citizens.
Okay, um, so what I'm hearing is that you'd expect, if you went out and looked for statistics, you'd expect to find out that let's say, prosperity of, and this is just, you know, I'm just trying to help you restate these things.
Hmm.
Like if we picked a certain, say the bottom 10% or the bottom 20% or whatever, and looked at how well they do and compare across cities, you'd expect to find that smaller cities have a better outcome. Is that the idea?
Yeah, yeah. I
Okay.
guess maybe how I would put it succinctly would be that the smaller the communities that you belong to, um, by the more likely you are to be happy than people who largely belong to large communities.
So when you say happy, are we still talking about the same thing? Are we still talking about the lowest, you know, rungs of society having their basic needs met, or are we talking about something else?
I would say it goes beyond basic needs met. I mean, I think like you have a lot like depression is at kind of an all-time high right now. So you have a lot of people who are decently high up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but uh, I would say are in a mild state of suffering, um, and it's kind of subtle. So it's not necessarily quite at the crisis level that you would imagine um, a something at a government level getting involved in, but those people are still unhappy. So when it comes to happiness, I guess I'm also talking about like general like emotional and intellectual fulfillment
Uh-huh.
in your
all,
life.
all sorts of well-being.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay. I think that's clear enough. So um, if you were to look and compare, across a bunch of different cities, let's just to pick an example, we talk about maybe cities, um, that you'd expect to find that smaller cities would have fewer people who are miserable, and you'd expect to proportionally, I guess, and you'd expect to find in bigger cities that proportionally there's a lot more people who are miserable or don't have their basic needs met or don't have, compared to the society that they're in, they're so much worse than the average, something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, yeah.
That sounds like it about sums it up.
Okay. Do you think, what do you think it would take to convince you otherwise? Like, if you actually looked at some studies and found out that small cities had more incarceration, maybe more, nutritional problems, maybe they had more health, mental health problems. Do you think that that would actually change your opinion?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think that like any good conviction that you have without data to back it up, there's a lot of like touchy feely stuff in there
Yeah.
that makes it a little hard to um, summarize with the available statistics we have without doing some kind of
Sure.
very in-depth survey
And
that asks the specific question.
just because I didn't say this before, I'm not going to ask for any facts, and
Sure, sure.
I'm not going to bring out any facts. We're just talking about theoretically, what are the kinds of facts that would change your position?
Okay, so with the caveat that there are many conflating details like that you could say are kind of similar to getting at the question. I think those would be hard to convince me. I guess I guess I could be convinced of it. I mean, I've gotten a lot of satisfaction in my life, even when I have been, when I've lived in a larger city. So it's not like I had a bad experience in New York and I was like, oh, okay, large cities are bad.
Sure. Sure.
So I'm not completely against the idea. I will definitely say it's largely driven by anecdotal experiences. Probably a lot of like sentimental TV feelings where it's like a small town.
Yeah. Sure.
Everybody knows, it's like the classic Cheers intro, like a bar where everybody knows your name, that kind of thing. I think it's largely informed by that. So I could probably be compelled by numerical data that just kind of across the board says, hey, people who live in cities and work at large corporations and live in large apartment buildings, they just happen to be happier.
Yeah.
But anecdotally, that doesn't really line up with my experience.
Sure. Sure. but it sounds like you'd actually be open to re-evaluating your stance if you found out, like, we could be really specific, maybe there's fewer people starving, maybe, or something like that in a bigger city than in a rural town. um,
Well, I don't know that I would be sufficiently convinced that people having their basic necessities met
uh-huh.
is an optimal outcome.
Okay, so really,
Um,
it's about more than just basic needs. It's about, is it is it about the average person compared to the worst person, or is it about sort of more like, if you ask the person, how are you doing, they would say better than four, or something like that? Or, like, could you maybe be more specific about what you want from society?
yeah, that's closer to it. I mean, I guess the concern that I have is that um, there's a large emphasis on people in really bad situations. Um, I think especially with like the BLM protests, like not being randomly killed is like a very basic minimum ask,
Sure.
and that's what people are really fixated on, because the things that are the most violating of your basic needs and rights
Yeah.
are deserve the most attention. But I think the problem is that um, to me, on a macro scale, we kind of lose the people who hit, to take your hypothetical scale where the number of people saying I'm better than a four. We've left a lot of people at the three or the two, where you're not suffering in an acute, obvious way, on a daily basis, but some of the things that I know that I would be really upset without, like, you just don't have in your life. And it's a little tricky to expect a complete stranger to provide it, but it's a little bit more reasonable for a neighbor to provide it.
Uh-huh.
If it's something more like emotional or romantic or um, spiritual, kind of just like if there's something that you're missing, but there isn't really a prescription for it.
Okay. So it sounds like you have an expectation of basic needs that are more than just survivability, that are more than, you have food to eat. It's about living in a society that makes you comfortable, for some sort of, like you would describe your life as not being one of suffering. Maybe
Yeah,
that's just ultimately the way to say it, is how many people would say that they were suffering.
yeah. I think that could be a pretty good
Okay.
heuristic for what I'm getting at.
And if we did this, if we did the experiment where we went and we asked different cities, we asked random samples, and it turned out that um, that in big cities a smaller proportion of people said that they were suffering, you'd actually be open to changing your mind about this. Is that accurate?
I would say
Or
it would be less about, I would see that and go, all right, my mind has changed, But I
sure,
would
yeah,
I would seriously reconsider my assumption,
yeah,
because I think that it's been pretty easy to lay that at the feet of a lot of what I see in the world, because I just sort of, like, I have that assumption, and cities tend to be the nexus of culture at a global scale. And
yeah,
so when you see a lot of people unhappy, they tend to live in a city. And then I'm like, okay, yeah, that adds up with my worldview.
yeah.
So I would have to re-examine a lot of the things that I right now take for granted, given that assumption. I would
Yeah.
have to say, okay, well, if that assumption's not true, I really need to think about. um, all sorts of, like, why is depression so high? If more people are living cities now than ever,
Yeah.
and cities are what make people happy, like, it has to be something else.
Uh-huh. Okay. So that's pretty much the whole thing. I'm happy to push back on different aspects of this. I think it might be interesting to talk about why you think this is the role of society. I think that might be an interesting thing to spend a couple more minutes on if you want. We could also talk about any sort of aspect of this that maybe you've realized, I haven't really put that into words, maybe, or do you have an interest in doing that?
Yeah, I guess, one thing I maybe want to clarify is, I think that this, like, we'll say misery index is a good target for society. I don't know if it's the role or responsibility for any individual to be responsible for another individual's suffering. Um,
So isn't that what a society is about? Is to do things to other people?
that's a very open-ended descriptor, but
Well,
I guess I mean it on an individual basis. I think that if you have a net negative output of misery, if you make more people miserable, then you make people happy, then I do think that you have a responsibility to examine the way you interact with other people and, reconsider it.
sure, but if we just stick to the concept of the society's role, the role of government, the role of let's say organizing bodies versus the individual. I mean, that because that's a different discussion. Is what does an individual um, what are the responsibilities of an individual in a group? Seems like it could be a different question than what are the responsibilities of a government.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I guess that we sort of have these very lofty goals for organizations as a whole, but nothing you would ever put on a single person. You wouldn't point at Bob and say, "All
Right.
right, Bob, your job is to make everybody happy."
Right.
Bob
Oh
can't do
yeah,
that.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
but
Yeah.
we're very willing to hoist that responsibility onto a group. But all a group is a collection of individuals. So
Yeah. Well, so let's explore that for a little bit. Um, let's try to circle back and make sure we're on the same page about this thing. So let's just take, or if you'll allow me, or if this sounds right to you, this sort of general idea that if we polled everybody and people weren't miserable, that's sort of the goal, right? Like we're trying to avoid this misery, these ones and twos and threes or something like that. Is
mhm.
Are you comfortable sort of accepting that, or is
Yeah,
that where you're
I'm
coming
down.
from? Okay, because that's what I'm
I'm
hearing.
down.
Yeah. So okay, so we have that goal, and now we're going to organize a government to try to accomplish this goal, or maybe maybe some other kind of organization. Maybe we organize ourselves. I think is kind of where you're coming from. But how could we make that index go up? I mean, what options does a government have to adjust that index?
Yeah, so I think that, um, like, one underappreciated, I think, role of government is to, I don't know how to explain this, so I'm going to use an analogy.
Yeah.
Have you ever been to a party and the party just sucks, and no one's having a good time, and and nobody's dancing to the music or something like that. And you just know that if a few people were to spontaneously start dancing, everyone would see that it was okay to start dancing.
Okay.
And then everyone would have a good time. This is, obviously an oversimplification, but I feel
Sure.
that a governing body kind of has the ability to sort of suggest to everyone that it is okay to dance now. So
these are the words that this society needs in these troubling times, is that it's okay to dance.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for some reason by being able to have this like layer of abstraction, you can have these messages or these ideas put out that aren't owned by individuals. They sort of at face value come without bias, and they're just sort of a suggestion of how to do things. Like for instance, in Austin, our governor has said that, or rather in Texas, our governor has said that like coronavirus isn't a big deal. We're going to reopen everything. And so I noticed that people aren't wearing their masks.
Yeah.
A lot. Whereas in other cities, even when it's not illegal, when there is sort of a suggestion from the governing body that it is important and that you should wear a mask, even though there's no enforcement, and I don't have the data on this, purely anecdotal.
It's okay.
But I tend to notice that other cities outside of Texas have a much higher, if you were to just take a random sampling, much higher number of people wearing masks. And so it's not using force to, get somebody to do something, because I know that in a lot of states it's not illegal. They can't do that. They can just advise it. But it tends to have an outsized effect to just have a supposedly neutral body suggest an action, because people are very receptive to subtle nudges in a certain direction.
To put maybe a spin on it and see if you still agree with this. But it almost sounds like maybe you're saying, if we can get that index to go up, and to do so, we have to get people to do things they don't want to do, you're okay with that?
Yeah, I think as long as it's sort of a consensual way of doing it.
The difference between a nudge and a push.
Yeah, like I think a good example of this is a relationship where you have a partner and you really like that partner and you want to appease them, and you want to make sure that they continue to like you, and they don't have to outright say, I will break up with you if you don't do X.
Yeah.
They will simply indicate their
preference.
Yeah, their preference for X, and you'll probably do it because you sort of like the cohesion you got going on, and you're willing to maintain it. And so there doesn't have to be an explicit agreement. There can just sort of be a nudge towards a certain direction, and then all of a sudden, I'm taking out the trash on Sundays, and I don't mind it that much. Even though I hate taking out the trash.
So to go back to the original claim, what makes you think that the smaller societies are better? And don't let me put words in your mouth, but maybe what you're saying is that smaller societies are better at nudging, and larger societies don't nudge very well. Is that maybe part of it?
I think that could be part of it. I don't know that for a fact. I will definitely say in my case, I get like very discouraged by large numbers. So when I see that people feel 41 million to 51 million on an issue, or sorry, 49 million to 51 million on an issue.
Yeah. I
consider, wow, you have to win over 1 million people to push that issue. That's a lot of people. But if you heard 49 to 51, you only have to convince one person to kind of, flip an issue.
Uh-huh.
not flip, but get
Yeah.
deadlocked.
Balance the scale. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it. Um, I also think that outliers or dissenting voices become very large as a result of that too. Where if you have a large group and let's say 1% of your group is like burning down buildings for some reason, I don't know why. If you're in a large city, 1% of a large city burning down buildings is like a travesty. It's insane.
Yeah.
Whereas if there's you live in a small town and there's some crazy arsonist and it's one guy, that doesn't look like a big issue.
Right.
It's a small problem. So I think it makes problems look smaller and look attainable, and kind of encourages you as a participant to actually try to get involved in those problems because the goal seems really attainable.
Okay, so it really sounds like you're making an actual prediction here, which is great. Like it sounds like you're saying if we looked at a smaller society, we'd see more involvement, we'd see more um, engagement, and we could measure that kind of thing. And again, well, first that is the claim that you're making. That is the prediction that you're making. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I would be willing to say that if you work at a small company, you probably wear more hats, you do more work, like
Yeah.
I don't know how you measure productivity, but it's probably higher.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that if you look at a small town, you probably see people more involved in town events, public services, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and and so that would mean if we did look and we did find out that in fact, um, for whatever reason, and I'm not saying this is the case, but for whatever reason that maybe in large cities, maybe a larger percentage of people did participate, you'd be open to reconsidering your perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Like I guess my perspective informs my interest in being a part of that. I've never tuned into a city council meeting. I haven't been here long enough to vote, but I could totally see myself skipping voting in a local election because a million people sounds very large. But if I think if many people were involved in these kinds of things, like a high percentage, and I was just being a passenger, I would think very differently about the next time I see an opportunity to
Right.
be involved, because it would sort of feel like um, it would feel like maybe when you look at a large city and you don't necessarily feel that you belong with all of it, maybe part of the problem is because you've actively distanced yourself from it.
Yeah. It kind of sounds like you're saying you can totally imagine that it's only you who is disconnecting, and maybe it's possible that maybe other people actually feel more connected in cities. Is that accurate?
It's very hard for me to believe.
It's hard for you to
um,
believe. Could you imagine it?
I guess so. I mean, I would say that in my personal life, I don't have a good track history of being involved in large organizations, and so I could imagine that I have a kind of a built-in aversion to it, and I have some preconceived notion that it's not effective, and
Yeah.
that that for some reason I'm the odd man out, because I've always worked at startups, gone to small schools or didn't go to school,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So clearly I'm living my life to some extent by this belief, and if I found out, oh hey, I don't have any data to back that up, I would certainly have to reconsider
Cool.
if that's a good sort of axiom to just say, all right, this is true.
Yeah. So that's the whole point of this.